Okay, folks, we're gonna get started. I want to welcome everyone who's here in person and also folks who are on Zoom. This is the MCL Climate Action Working Group's meeting with Stanford's Michael Wara. Some quick comments for those that are in the Zoom audience. Just bear with us. This is the first time that the Climate Action Working Group is holding a hybrid meeting. We're in a venue and using technology that we're unfamiliar with. So as anybody who's worked with technology knows, that's a recipe for things going wrong. And we'll do our best to fix things, but please be patient. Before I go any further, Chris Yolanis from our venue VenturePad is going to briefly tell us a bit about the meeting space. Chris, here's your 60 seconds.
Thanks, Bob. Welcome, everyone. I'm Chris Yolanis. I'm the founder and owner of VenturePad, which is rated Marin's top co-working and entrepreneurship center. So we have open desks and reserve desks and private offices and conference rooms, all for supporting impact entrepreneurs, remote workers, activists like you all are. So we're very pleased to host this event. As activists and as leaders, if you do have any need for meeting space, we have that. Just go to our website, which is venturepad.works. You can also call me. I'm on the website. So welcome and enjoy.
Thanks. Thanks, Chris. Okay, so now Marin Conservation League's mission is to preserve, protect, and enhance the natural assets of Marin in a changing environment. MCL's Climate Action Working Group advocates for leading-edge policies that slow climate change that is so damaging to the natural assets of Marin and everywhere else. And our focus is on building and vehicle electrification, on decarbonizing the grid, on cleaner electricity, and on removing carbon from the atmosphere. Other MCL committees deal with a really wide range of environmental issues, including adaptation to climate change. If you're not a member of Marin Conservation League, you can support our work by going to our website, marinconservationleague.org/donate, and become a member. So some housekeeping first. We're going to have two main parts to this meeting. Michael first will present on the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, Climate Change Scoping Plan. And we'll have questions and discussions. And then Michael, who is an expert on many issues, will also present on wildfire risk mitigation. And again, we'll have questions and discussions. I want to introduce two people working with me on this program. Ken Strong is a longtime MCL and Climate Action Working Group member, and he's going to set context and ask some questions to get the ball rolling. And Bill Cole is an MCL board and Climate Action Working Group member who's a real leader in advocating for wildfire risk mitigation, and she's the head of the Ecologically Sound Practices Partnership. Now for our terrific speaker tonight. Michael Wara is the Director of Policy at the Sustainability Accelerator at Stanford's Doerr School of Sustainability. He's a Mill Valley resident, His research and policy advising work focuses on energy, climate, and wildfire, and on the introduction of new technologies into the electricity sector, and on environmental justice. Wide range of interests and excellent work. He's been a member.
Louder, please.
He's been a member of prominent statewide commissions, and he's a real contributor to advancing effective climate change policy in the state. I could say much, much more about Michael, but I won't due to time. But what I will say is that we are extremely pleased to have Michael Wara here as our speaker. Now, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken Strong for some brief context and questions. And then you'll hear from Michael Wara. Ken?
Okay, sounds good. We may be moving around. Yeah. Musical chairs. Good evening, everyone. So the first, as Bob said, the first thing we're going to be talking about is the CARB scoping plan. For some context, every 5 years, the California Air Resources Board sets forth a plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions as mandated by the state legislature. The most recent plan, which was approved in December 2022, describes how the state intends to meet the legislatively mandated target of achieving carbon neutrality and reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 85% below 1990 levels no later than 2045. The CARB press release stated the plan would deliver a 71% reduction in air pollution and describes a dramatic reduction in fossil fuel demand while continuing to grow the California economy. The plan is based on modeling and includes many assumptions and unproven technologies such as hydrogen and carbon capture. Questions have been raised as to whether the assumptions in the plan are achievable or need to be revised now before California falls behind on its trying to meet these goals. Michael, what are the challenges in meeting the CARB plan, and what does California need to do to meet the legislative target?
So that's a great introduction to what the scoping plan is and kind of its place in California climate policy. Obviously, California for a long time has been a leader in trying to architect and also implement effective climate policy. I think it's worth just stepping back from the scoping plan for just 1 second, and then we're going to dive in to have perspective about where we are and what we have accomplished in terms of emission reductions and a sort of broader strategy. You know, things that work for the first few percent may not work for the last, or as you get deeper into cutting emissions. And, you know, probably all of us or many of us got here, maybe some of us rode our bikes here, but I certainly drove here. And, you know, we're just starting, you know, there are large challenges ahead as we get done doing the easy stuff and have to really start doing hard stuff. The one thing I'd say, and this is something that CARB doesn't mention as much as I think they should, is that there is certainly a 2045 target that was enacted. Gosh, the sessions blur together. I think it was 2 sessions ago. AB 1279 established that 85% reduction. And also you may have heard a net neutrality requirement for the state. So 85% reduction in emissions is the minimum. We could go all the way to 0, or we could do carbon removal, right? Sucking carbon out of the atmosphere in order to hit that 0 level. But, you know, I think it's important to think about, like, where are we right now? What have we accomplished? You want me to?
No, I'm going to step over and switch places with Bob.
Oh, okay. Okay, sounds good.
You need your computer, right?
Logistics of the hybrid meeting. I do this all the time in our teaching too, so I'm used to these. But you know, we achieved the 2020 target several years early. The 2020 target that was set for California was to get back to 1990 levels. We did that. We have a 2030 target, which is much, much more ambitious. in terms of the rate of reductions that are required in order to achieve it. So imagine our peak emissions in California were around 2005 or 2006. Since the Great Recession, where we saw a large decline in emissions, as you know, mostly, you know, companies frankly went out of business and didn't come back. And a lot of those companies were relatively emissions intensive. The oil industry in California took a big hit. You know, you might feel good or bad about that depending on where you sit. But since 2009, emissions in California have been falling about 1.5 million tons per year, every year. That's if you could fit a pretty good trend line up to 2020, right? Which was obviously an anomalous year. We were all locked in our houses for a good part of that year. And many people worked from home even after they weren't locked down anymore. People who were fortunate enough to be able to do that, like myself. Emissions, but we're on a trend about cutting emissions about 1.5 million tons per year. In order to hit the 2030 target, which is the next target, the SB 32 target, that was one of the last bills that Fran Pavley, who was a real pioneer in climate legislation, got through the Senate before she was termed out. We need to reduce emissions about 6 million tons a year, not 1.5 million tons a year, because the SB 32 target is really the first target in California that's science-based. It's sort of consistent. If California did its part and the rest of the planet did its part, which the rest of the planet isn't doing its part, but let's just hypothetically say they did, we would all need to reduce emissions about 40% by 2030. And then we need to keep going from there and get to 85% or maybe 100% by about 2045 or maybe 2050. And that implies for California, this kind of 4% per year reduction, which works out to about 6 million tons. So we're only doing 1.5 million a year. The only year where we've really come close, well, there are 2 years where we've come close to doing the 6 million ton number. The first was the year of the deepest part of the Great Recession. Not something we want to repeat, right? I mean, that was a wrenching year. I remember in my neighborhood in Mill Valley, there were numerous homes that had been foreclosed and were just sitting vacant and decaying. Not something we want to see happen again. The other year where we've hit that benchmark was the COVID lockdown. And we actually didn't quite hit it in the COVID lockdown, but we were at 5 million tons because people stopped driving. We need to do that every year forever, right? And essentially forever, for a generation, in order to achieve the level of reductions that are required under California law. When CARB approaches developing a scoping plan, now I'm going to say a bunch of things where I am critical of CARB in a few minutes, but I want to try to walk in their shoes also, because I think that you don't go to work for the state of California because you think you're going to get rich. You don't go to work for the Air Resources Board because you want to be a shill for the oil industry, right? You do it because you care about the state and you care about the environment. And in the climate branch of CARB, I have a number of students that work in this branch, and I can tell you every single one of them went to work for CARB because they really want to make a difference on climate, right? CARB is faced with this challenge. We're achieving about 1.5 million tons with all of the policies, right? The renewable portfolio standard, all the support for electrification of vehicles, electrification of buildings, lots of other policies, you know, the natural and working land strategy that CARB has played a part in, along with the other parts of the Natural Resources Agency. And we need to achieve 6. And the real constraints on that, there are technological constraints, and there are also very important political constraints, right? And we need to be, I think we need to be honest about that. When CARB goes to make the scoping plan, they have to make a plan that says how they will comply with a legally binding target. They're not allowed to say, well, 1.5 million tons per year is what we're achieving. Let's be real, folks. That's what we're going to achieve going forward. And so we'll hit the target. I mean, if you do the math, we get to the 2030 target in about 2044 at that rate. Okay, so we're 14 years late. Even though we achieved the 2020 target early, that was a less ambitious objective. And we could achieve that target by doing some of the easy things. Like, for example, California mostly, I mean, we consume approximately 0 electric power that's generated from coal-fired power plants. We used to consume a lot of electric power that was generated from coal-fired power plants. They weren't in California. We built our coal plants on the res in Arizona and in Nevada and Utah, and we shipped it in over power lines, but it's still coal power, right? And the atmosphere doesn't care. We don't do that anymore. We forced all the utilities that bought that power to get out of those contracts or not renew them as they expired, and they've rolled off. And now we consume much cleaner power that's a combination of gas and solar and wind and hydro in a good year like this year. But that is relatively easy compared to, say, in the electric power sector, getting rid of all of the natural gas-fired power plants, right? Like on a day like today, or really this week and probably this weekend, it's going to rain like crazy this weekend in California. And were we solely dependent on renewables, we'd be in a real pickle because it'd be cold. Sun would not, I mean, I don't know if any of you have rooftop solar. I do. And you can see the difference on a cloudy day in terms of what your roof does, right? And multiply that by the state of California and you have rolling blackouts. So there are real technological challenges that ARB is grappling with in collaboration with the Energy Commission and the PUC. There are also economic constraints. Many of you are going to get a power bill at the end of January that you are not going to like, unless you're like me and I have net metering. I'm grandfathered in on the old net metering schedule, and I pay my $11 a month to PG&E, and then I pay a lot more money to Sunrun. But more or less, I'm insulated from these increases. But power prices in California are now at a level that really raise significant energy access concerns. There's lots of evidence from Arizona that people that live in hot places and are low income choose not to consume electricity to a dangerous degree, right? In a sense where they are putting, if they're older, if they're vulnerable, medically vulnerable in some other way, they're putting their lives at risk because they can't afford to buy the electric power. And they consume even less when the rates go up. We know this from good studies using smart meter data, where we were able to match the data. So there's economic challenges, right? We can't just raise electricity rates to buy the things we want. And ARB, when they make this plan, they have to come up with something that says, here's how we're going to achieve all these very ambitious targets. Here's how we're going to bend the curve down. Like the curve is going down, but it needs to go down steeper. And that's not easy. I personally would prefer a message to the governor and the legislature that says, hey, you know what? You passed these very ambitious laws, and we are actually not reducing emissions at the rate that is consistent with achieving the ambition. And so you politicians need to think about that and either decide that the level of ambition is too much. I don't think anyone in California elected office wants to say that about our climate targets, or we need to be doing more ambitious things and things that are going to make places like Marin look different. Things that are hard politically, right? Certainly things that are going to make places like San Francisco, where I grew up. I live in Mill Valley now, but I grew up in the Sunset District. Make the Sunset look real different, where most of the Sunset is zoned for 2 stories. And so there's a limit on how many people you can house if the building footprint is only 2 stories. And there's enormous opposition. As we all know, we're all a part of the discussions around housing in California, but they have implications for climate policy because they have implications for whether transit is cost effective. They have implications for choices people make in their lives about how they do the things they need to do, how their kids get home from school, and that's all kind of baked in. ARB has to make a plan. They did make the plan. Another choice that they made in the current scoping plan, and I think this reflects the political pressure and the challenge that they face, is, what exactly is a plan? In the old days, I've been a party to 3 rounds of this scoping planning process. In the old days, ARB would propose a plan that included a list of regulations that they plan to implement, right? So they'd say, we're going to do this regulation and that regulation and the 3rd regulation. And we think the regulation, based on our modeling and estimates, will achieve this many reductions. And therefore, we can stack up a bunch of regulations and get to the target. This time around, they did energy system modeling, right? They said, we're gonna somehow, certain technologies will be deployed in California that will reduce emissions by a certain amount. What they didn't say is, here are the steps we are going to take to actually make sure that those technologies are deployed. Here's the political capital we're going to invest in making sure those technologies are deployed, because the political capital is very high. And frankly, it's not ARB's political capital, right? It's the governors and it's the legislatures, and they may have other priorities. They might not. Sometimes they don't, but climate is not the only thing, right? And the legislature is concerned about education and wildfire risk and lots of other issues. So what did ARB do? They assumed in the transport sector, ARB has a lot of information. They have very good information because ARB is the lead regulator of cars and trucks in California. They have been, in many respects, path-breaking and ambitious, like for 50 years, right? Since smoke committees were formed in Southern California, because when you go outside, you would tear from the sulfur and the carbon monoxide in the atmosphere. So they know about cars. Mary Nichols, who was, for a long time the chair of the board, essentially led the negotiations that resulted in national deals with the automakers. So they don't just know cars, they know the car industry, and they know how to cut deals and make progress. And they know the limits of their ability to force new technologies into the market in the car space. And they've been pretty effective at doing that, right? I said I drove here in a Model 3. And Tesla's, however you feel about Elon Musk, are a pretty remarkable product that's really changed how people think about electric vehicles. And Tesla wouldn't be here but for California and also federal support. But the mandates that California put in place and the ability for Tesla to monetize those mandates early on in its life. Where ARB is less knowledgeable, I think it's fair to say, is in the introduction of new technologies into the electric power space and the industrial space. So, and by industry in California, we don't have, unfortunately, I would say, a ton of industry left in California, heavy industry. We have a food processing industry that is mammoth because of our agricultural industry. And we also have an oil industry that not so much upstream, but downstream, the refineries in Richmond, right, which are major industrial facilities that generate a lot of emissions because they burn natural gas to generate heat for all the chemical reactions that have to happen to turn crude oil into gasoline and diesel and plastic. But ARB has, less expertise when it comes to how might we decarbonize these sectors. And I guess the other sector I'd add to that is agriculture. And agriculture, these sectors become more important as we go deeper in our emission cuts, because our basic strategy so far has been lean up the electricity sector, right? Achieve our 100% RPS goal that was first made into law in a bill called SB 100 that passed, 5 or 6 years ago. But we've had an RPS target for a long time. Every few years, we strengthen it, and people say, oh, if you do that, the grid will break. And then we achieve the target, and then we set a higher target, and people say, oh, if you achieve that, the grid will break. And that's kind of a repeat play that happens in California's history. And we're doing well. We've had some bumps in the road, obviously, in that space, but we're getting there, and we're making progress. The harder challenge is electrifying everything else, right? So there's clean electricity. That's pillar A of our strategy. And then pillar B is reduce, turn everything into an electricity consumer. And part of that is cars. Cars, we're making lots of progress on. I think the data just came out at the federal level. I think something like 9+% of light duty vehicles sold in 2023 were electric. That is remarkable progress. Like, that is a very fast change. It is one thing to be selling lots of EVs in Marin. It is totally a different thing to be selling them in Houston or in, really like red parts of the country or low-income parts of the country or parts of the country that do not prioritize charging infrastructure in the way that California does, because if you can't charge your car, that's kind of a drag. So we're making progress there, but that's like one slice of transport, right? Everyone probably gets boxes from Amazon. Where do those come from? They come from giant logistics centers out in, Tracy for us. And they're shipped there on 18-wheel trucks that burn diesel. And they're mostly delivered on medium duty fleets that burn diesel. And what do we do about that? We're making progress in the medium duty, not a lot of progress in the heavy duty. But those are the kinds of challenges that everybody has to deal with. And then on the industrial side, most things that you consume that are manufactured in chemical reactions, natural gas is involved, right? You burn natural gas to generate high quality heat that is used to drive chemical reactions. And I don't just mean refining oil. That's a big one, obviously. But, I like milk. My kids drink a lot of milk. Milk is pasteurized by burning natural gas to create a controlled source of heat that's used to heat up the milk to a certain temperature, not too high, not too low. And that's how you get milk that doesn't kill you, the store. And so all of these different processes need to change. In California, partly because of our legacy of, early legacy of oil, the oil industry and the natural gas industry or the fossil methane industry. We have a lot of buildings that consume natural gas for heat. And so part of getting to zero is basically changing the building stock entirely in California. My home was built in the 1950s in Tamalpais Valley. Great old house. It's built to use a natural gas furnace. I will need to get a heat pump at some point if I'm going to get rid of natural gas in my home. That is doable now. It's much more doable than it used to be, but it's not easy. And, my colleague who runs our environmental law clinic at Stanford just got heat pump, furnace, and hot water. And, it was a headache. And it cost a lot of money, even with all of the rebates. And she knows how to get all the rebates, right? But it still costs significantly more than natural gas, redoing her furnace with a modern, very efficient natural gas furnace would have cost. And so there's all of these steps that have to be taken. The scoping plan as written by ARB assumes a set of things that I think are somewhat implausible. And specifically, it assumes a ton of deployment of what's called carbon capture and storage, which basically means you have a smokestack, you're burning natural gas, because in California, we're not burning coal. Maybe somewhere else this would refer to a coal plant, but you're burning natural gas and you put a scrubber on top of the smokestack and take the CO2 out of the flue gas, the combustion products that are coming up the stack. And then you take that carbon dioxide and you put it, you clean it up, you compress it to a supercritical fluid, then you pipe that fluid over to somewhere where there's a good reservoir to store it, and you inject it several miles underground, hopefully permanently. Now, this technology is well understood in certain contexts. In particular, in the oil and gas industry, sometimes when you drill for oil or gas, you get something coming up the well that's like half natural gas, half carbon dioxide. And the oil industry for a long time has separated the natural gas from the carbon dioxide. And sometimes they take that CO2 and they use it to get more oil out of the ground. They inject it into fields to kind of pressurize the field and push more oil up their wells. There's much less experience with doing this to capture industrial emissions, which are, combustion emissions that are complicated, have lots of, contaminants in them, like sulfur dioxide, for example, nitrogen oxides, and actually cleaning that up and piping it somewhere and injecting it in the ground. The Biden administration is enthusiastic about this technology, largely because unions are enthusiastic about this technology, and the Biden administration is very pro-union, which is great. But the reality is that the technology has been deployed in very few places around the world, and where it has been deployed, it has not worked very well, and it has been very expensive. So if you assume that we can do this all over the place in California, you're assuming a technology development process that happens A, fast, and B, where you see performance that we haven't seen demonstrated at many or any facilities, really. The best CCS operations today are happening in Alberta, where Alberta has really supported this because of the tar sands. They want to clean up emissions associated with the tar sand, so it's less of a dirty product from people's perspective. And they've done this in a few places where they're taking natural gas that's used for various industrial purposes, sort of refining the tar sands into something called bitumen, which then can be shipped to America and refined further, and they capture the carbon from those operations. But it's been hard. The facilities don't really work to spec if you look closely at them, if you sort of take a hard-nosed economic view, rather than a kind of rosy environmental regulator wants it to work out kind of view. And it's expensive. I mean, just bottom line is it's super expensive. And so those facilities then are competing against facilities that don't have that obligation. Maybe they aren't in Alberta. Maybe they're in Michigan or in, this is where my Canadian geography gets really bad, like who is south of Alberta, but the
East.
Yeah. So that's one technology that the scoping plan relies heavily on. And then I think many in the environmental community are pretty skeptical of. I'd be the first to say, I'd be happy to see that technology work out. Mostly in the United States, it has resulted in facilities that don't work, and are incredibly expensive for the people that pay for them. No one in their right mind would build one of those facilities based on its own project economics. Typically, when people want to build CCS facilities, they say, where's my government handout? And then I'll build it. And so again, this raises this question, this larger point about the scoping plan. It's fine to model this stuff, but you actually have to have a policy that will achieve the modeled outcome. And that is where this scope.
Not sure.
Power.
We got power now.
Yeah, we're doing good. Can everybody hear us on the Zoom? We
Yeah,
dropped off.
You're back now. You dropped off, and then when you first came on, you were muted, but you're good now.
Okay. So the other technology that the scoping plan relies, I'm going to list two more. The scoping plan relies heavily on is green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is a largely unproven technology. It involves taking a water molecule, turning it into hydrogen and oxygen, and then capturing that hydrogen and using it as a fuel. If you make it from solar energy, right, you take water and you use solar energy to break that hydrogen-oxygen bond, then you've produced a zero carbon fuel. But that is hard to do. It is not done at any large scale at this point. The Chevron refinery in Richmond is trying to do this to the tune of like 10 tons per day, which is like, you're not running a power plant, right? It's like kind of a hobby. But it might work out. ARB assumes, just one second, ARB assumes that it does work out, but there is no plan about how to build and permit hydrogen infrastructure at the scale necessary to achieve the ARB targets. And let me tell you, it's a lot of infrastructure, right? You cannot put hydrogen in the existing natural gas pipeline network. We would have to build an entirely new network because hydrogen is a small molecule and it will leak right out of the pipes. It will also corrode the pipes so they break. And that's not good. As we all know, if we've lived around here long enough to remember San Bruno, we don't want to have transmission pipelines breaking. So hydrogen, that's another fuel, another source of the zero carbon energy, essentially stuff, I think of this as gap filling, right? Like there's a gap between what we know how to do and what we need to do. And ARB is putting technologies into that gap and saying, well, this will do it, and that'll do it, and this will do it. The third thing is carbon dioxide removal, which I'm actually, I think, optimistic about in the long run. But we got to be realistic. We do about 5,000 tons a year on the planet, maybe 10,000 tons this year of carbon dioxide removal. ARB assumes that we're doing 20 million tons a year in the 2030s. So that is a fast ramp for a technology that is not well understood and is very energy intensive. If we had to do the amount of carbon dioxide removal for California that the ARB scoping plan envisions, we would have to build a second electricity grid to generate the electric power necessary to do it. Now, we're not going to do that. So that's where we are with the scoping plan. We need to have a conversation in California about what we are willing to do, what the purpose is, and how we actually execute on our goals. And our goals and our execution have kind of separated as we've moved into this more ambitious part of our science-based target. And I hope that someday soon that conversation can happen. Thinking politically, I do not think it can happen until we have a new governor, because it's going to be hard to say we're not meeting our targets for the current governor. It's just asking something of him that politically, given his national ambitions, going to be tough. But the sooner we can have it, the better, because then we can start to have this better conversation about, well, what are we going to do? What are we, if we're not able to achieve what we thought we could, what are we willing to do? And how do we make sure that low-income Californians aren't priced out of energy access? How do we try to address some of the environmental justice concerns that are very, I work with a lot of folks that are community activists in Richmond, and their kids, my kids take the bus home and get off the school bus in Mill Valley. Their kids, are waiting at the school bus when there's a flaring event at the refinery in Richmond, or they're at soccer practice and there's like a shelter in place issued because the Marathon refinery has to burn off everything in its catalytic cracker all of a sudden because there's a power failure or something. And, how we address those concerns at the same time as we deal with these climate challenges, I think it's a really big issue. So I don't know if I covered questions.
No, you did. But there's another source of energy that the state is trying to use to electrify everything, and that's out of state power.
Mhm.
We rely on 30% of our power needs right now are filled by out of state. And if we want to continue, and we'd like to continue, perhaps expand the use of the hydro and out of state wind
Mhm.
and out of state solar. Meanwhile, we have our neighbors who are also trying to use up all this stuff. And there's a Southwestern Power Pool, a group out of a number of states, and there's California trying to figure out how we're going to get organized to cooperate on using out-of-state power. How's that going to work?
Well, I guess the main message I would say on this one is, and this kind of goes back to the higher level issue, we got to take some chances politically if we're going to achieve what we need to achieve on climate. I am old enough to remember rolling blackouts and all of the electricity problems that we had, and I teach it in my classes and work with people who were directly involved in going to FERC and saying, there's market manipulation. And FERC was like, oh no, hands off the markets, just, let supply and demand balance. And we all know that there actually was a lot of market manipulation. And they're very afraid of, kind of regionalizing our electricity supplies. I think it's essential. I think in the long run, if we are going to get to 100% renewables, we need to build every solar plant we can. We need to put as many panels on rooftops as we can. And we are going to have to rely on our neighbors, on our partners, and we'll rely on them sometimes. And then like, I think it was August 15th, APS, Arizona, almost totally blacked out. Arizona almost had a system failure, and they relied heavily on us and our excess solar power to keep the lights on when it was like 125 degrees in Phoenix. And so it's a both and, right? It's partnership. And we are a big enough, strong enough state, and our ambitions, 10 years ago, those states, the red states in the Intermountain West wanted to keep their coal plants on. All their utilities now want to do everything they can to get rid of their coal plants and build more solar and batteries. That is the economic reality for electric utilities. And so I actually think that the technologies and the economics of technologies have evolved in a way where we can partner and not worry too much about our bigger energy and climate objectives being undermined. And that's another big part of this. But we all know, like, building stuff in California is hard. I mean, we're doing a remodel on our house, and that's hard, right? Let alone building a high voltage transmission line to Arizona. So we have to figure out ways to do that better and faster. And that's another compromise, right? Where we need to take risk and be uncomfortable.
I think maybe we're ready for some questions from the audience. First of all, anybody that's here that's got questions on this topic for Michael? Well,
So you mentioned some of the focuses of the scoping plan, but I didn't hear you address the potential role that's played by electrification of residences and buildings, particularly residences, in how the scoping plan addresses that, the necessary incentives, the support, the structure. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so sure. The question was about electrification of buildings and the degree to which the scoping plan assumes or requires or envisions electrification of buildings playing a large role in achieving targets. What I'd say is, in the long run, by 2045, we have to assume that buildings are electrified if we're going to achieve an 85% cut, because the really hard stuff is in agriculture, right? Like, how do you drink milk and not have cows that burp methane, right? It's hard. How do you deal with fertilizer, which is essential to modern agriculture, to feeding a planet with 8 billion people? And those are the hard emissions. Buildings are actually a lot easier than that, but they are also very hard because we have regulated monopoly utilities that supply natural gas, and they're very concerned about their business being eliminated, sort of like Saudi Arabia is concerned about their business being eliminated too. And in the current context, electricity rates are really high. Natural gas rates were high, not so much anymore. And so there are affordability concerns, there are reliability concerns, because people around here, like I don't know if all you experienced public safety power shutoffs or live in places where there is reduced reliability of electric power because of wildfire safety issues. So there's lots of concerns, and my mom just likes her gas stove. I'm gonna like pry it from her fingers someday, but it's gonna be tough. And I just say the reality of the building situation is a slow transition, and it's one that is going to be challenging, and that's mostly because of a failure to really to do this. This is a great example. To do building electrification, the right way to do it is like block by block, not house by house. You do it block by block because then you can throw away the pipes in the ground. You don't have to maintain them. If you do it house by house, that pipe that you have to maintain so it doesn't explode under everyone's feet is serving fewer and fewer customers. And so the per customer cost of that pipe is going up and up and up. Who are the people that are going to be left buying natural gas? The people who can't afford heat pumps, right? Low-income people, people in rental housing where the landlord is like, you pay the PG&E bill, I don't care. And so the solution for that problem has not been developed. There are pilots in the East Bay where PG&E is attempting to do these kind of neighborhood electrification approaches, but SoCalGas isn't doing them. And it's going to be, I just say it's going to be a real challenge. The assumption in the scoping plan is we do electrify buildings. We are not on track. It is hard. And politically, it's especially hard.
Would you say your name? Oh, Danielle Hagan. Could you tell me or explain a little bit more about how does California define its carbon footprint? It just seems really overwhelming. And where do they draw the line?
California uses sure. How does California define its carbon footprint? Like, you gotta, to reduce something, you gotta measure it. How do we measure it? We measure what most people would call scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and we do not measure scope 3 emissions. So what that means is in like regular language, it means we measure we count the things that we burn in California or otherwise create greenhouse gas emissions. We also count the emissions associated with imports of electricity. So like all those imports you mentioned, a lot of them come from natural gas fired power plants. Like, let's be real, right? 50% of the power we consume is from natural gas at this point. And so we count those emissions. What we don't count is, say, we're going to build a bridge and the steel comes from China and the steel was made using coal. Those emissions do not count. And so if our policies cause, say, well, cement's actually a good example. About half the cement in California comes from China. If we create policies that cause our cement market to shift toward imported cement as opposed to domestically produced cement, or even cement that's made in Nevada, say, then we don't count that shift. We would see a reduction in emissions in California, but not, the accompanying increase somewhere else. That's a problem. IPCC accounting assumes that everybody's doing it and that everybody has policies, and, not true at the state level, more true at the national level. Did you have a question? I thought someone.
Bill?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bill?
Yeah, you mentioned a bit ago that solar and batteries were all the rage with utilities across the country. Well, California just made it really difficult to have rooftop solar.
Yes.
So how do you solve that?
Well, so let me be clear. So the question was, I said solar plus batteries, solar plus storage is all the rage with utilities across the country. Why did California make it hard to have what I'll call distributed solar plus storage? And the reason, so first of all, that comment that I made applies to utility scale. So the largest battery facility in the United States is down at Morro Bay, the old Morro Bay power plant, where you might go kayaking in Elkhorn Slough. Behind that fence are just rows of utility scale batteries. They're about the size of a container, like for a TCU, and they hold a bunch of lithium ion cells, and they discharge and charge basically to soak up excess solar in the middle of the day and then supply it in the evening, like right now. The utilities love that stuff because they can build it themselves. It's cheaper than rooftop, and it's cheaper than distributed batteries because it's kind of like wholesale versus retail. The utilities in California have pushed very hard to reduce the incentives for especially rooftop solar. They like storage more, actually, but they did that because rooftop solar customers like myself, and I am one of these people, I'll just fly that flag. I use the grid like a giant battery. I produce more solar than I consume during the day when wholesale electric power is worth almost zero in California, especially on a sunny day when my rooftop's doing great. And then I get home from work in the afternoon and I'm like, I want to turn everything on. And I consume a lot more power than I produce in the afternoon. You could think about that kind of, the analogy is like using the grid like a gigantic battery. And I use that, but I get to sell my power to PG&E for whatever it is now. I think it's insane now. It's like 44 cents a kilowatt hour during the day. The cost to PG&E of buying utility scale solar power is like 3 cents. So the utilities see this as a way for me to avoid paying my fair share of the costs of the services that I consume. There is a complicated argument about like what the appropriate compensation should be for solar and especially solar and storage. I personally think we need to be giving people a lot of batteries. And then part of that relates to trying to reduce the cost of electric power, like making it easy for PG&E to turn the power off in places where there's danger. And instead of say like, but that's an issue that's kind of separate from what if you live in San Francisco where there's no wildfire risk and you'd like to reduce your electric power bill by having solar and maybe solar plus a battery. So the commission took an action where they tried to compromise on this issue between what the big rooftop solar companies wanted and what the utilities wanted, and they sort of struck a middle position. It's led to a dramatic reduction in solar installation. Like Sunrun laid off several thousand people. And say again?
Stock is at like $2.
Yeah, I mean, and everybody took a big hit in their valuations because it changes, the whole business model was built on a set of incentives that were then changed. I think we're not done there. Like, I guess I look at this and we could get into like the nitty gritty of the various moves parties are making around electricity rates in California. It's complicated and probably would put all of you to sleep, especially the people online. But we're not done with the rooftop solar conversation in California. I think we're especially not done with the battery conversation. And the real thing we need to be doing now is helping people that have existing rooftop contracts get batteries on their houses so they can shift that power. I mean, the other thing that we do is we never consume peak power. We never consume power between 7 and midnight from the grid because it's super expensive, and we have batteries on our house, so we can take our solar energy, charge up the batteries, and then discharge them at night. And we need more Californians doing that. Again, because we need to build batteries wherever we can. We need to build utility scale batteries, and we need to build distributed batteries to help us have a reliable grid in a context where we're relying on solar and wind as much as possible.
Let's take a question from chat if we can, and then we got to switch topics. Can you pull up a question on chat and see if there's one that's worth?
There's less a question than a couple of folks who have indicated in chat that they love their induction stove.
Yes, me too. They're so great.
So they would be willing to provide support, I'm sure.
I'll give them my mom's number and they can call her and let her know.
But with that, I think it's time for us to move on to the next big topic. And one of the problems we have is these are big topics, so
Yeah.
It's possible to stay on them for a long time. But
Wildfire insurance, sure.
Maybe just a little preface on that, just.
Yes.
So, we're all aware of the risks of wildfire. Last November, you co-authored a study at the Stanford Woods Institute that reveals that low-intensity burning, such as controlled or prescribed fires, managed wildfires, and tribal cultural burning can dramatically reduce the risk of devastating fires for years at a time. Tell us about your study.
Sure. So, one of the things we do, or one of the things my team does at Stanford, is we listen to firefighters, and we would do a lot of work on wildfire policy, insurance policy, that relates to wildfire risk in the state of California. I was intimately involved in the creation of the current system we have for managing utility wildfire risk, for better or worse. But we also try to use machine learning based methods to basically quantify the things that we already know. We think quantification is really important because it allows you to value interventions, right? Sorry about that, folks online. And so one intuition, if you talk to any firefighter, any wildland firefighter, they'll say safety is in the black. That's like a number one rule. And what they mean by that is if you can be somewhere that has burned, right, in a wildland fire, you are safe because there's no fuel, right? Fire requires 3 things. It requires oxygen and fuel. And wait, what's the third thing? There's heat. Thank you. Yeah. And so an ignition source. And so if you can take one of those things away, you're safe. And so an intuition that a lot of folks that work in wildland fire have is that fire scars are protective for about 10 years. So like when you look at when really good fire mappers that work for the fire agencies are mapping like the potential progression of wildfire, they draw in all the fire scars from the last decade, because probably a wildfire will hit a fire scar and either slow down in a way where firefighters can step in and do interventions to stop the fire from progressing further, or the fire will just stop at that scar. And so, but when you ask people, well, like how protective? This doesn't work always, right? Sometimes it doesn't work. And like, what's the probability that it will work? How could we estimate like the value of an investment in more prescribed fire to create more fire scars on the landscape intentionally to protect communities? Like say, like what is the value of prescribed fire on Mount Tam to avoid a wildfire repeating the history, which exists, right? Where fires get started in the watershed and burn all the way across the Ross Valley. That's the history, right? We don't want to repeat that history today. When that happened, there was a ranch in the Ross Valley, right? Like 1941 was the last time this really happened. So what would the value be of putting fire on the ground in the water district in order to avoid a repeat of that outcome? How much fire would we have to put on the ground? How long would the treatment last? So we did a study to try to estimate that using complicated kind of machine learning based causal inference methods that I won't get into, but they're pretty much as good as you can do without actually running an experiment at this point. And we looked at all of the fires that have burned in California since 2004 and focused on the ones that were low intensity. So like the kind of things that actually create beneficial environmental effects in forests in California. And we said, how does the presence of low intensity fire change the odds of high intensity fire occurring on a spot in California in different ecosystems? And what we found is that you get about a 55 to 60% reduction in the risk of high intensity, like stuff that's going to be very resistant to any kind of wildland firefighting by having low intensity fire present. So you can reduce the chance, call it, I think it's fair to say about 60% for about 8.5 years. And the effect decays over time. And then at the end, it ticks off pretty quick. And that allows us to sort of say, well, what good would this do? How often would we have to show up again, show up and repeat the treatment, right? Just like you take, I am actually having some back pain today. So I took Advil this morning and I took Advil before I drove here from Stanford. And how often do I have to take Advil to not be doubled over in pain, wanting to lie flat on the floor? About every 6 hours. So the answer for prescribed fire is about every 8 to 10 years. But what we did was to quantify the reduction in risk for prescribed fire, for these high intensity catastrophic fires, like the one that burned in Paradise in 2018, where it did a 10-mile run in a few hours. But I think it's also really important to distinguish, and I want to just make this distinction between that kind of fire, a wildland fire, and the kinds of fires that we have experienced in Santa Rosa and in Paradise, and most recently in Lahaina. Those fires start as wildfires, and then they turn into something else. And this is really important to understand for a community that's thinking about availability of insurance, which is a big problem in California. Those fires really are what I would call a firefighter, I'm not a firefighter, but would call a conflagration, which basically means that one house lights on fire and is spewing embers and igniting the structures next to it, more like a row of dominoes falling over. And one thing that's new about the environment that we live in California and that other parts of the country are increasingly experiencing, like Oregon experienced it in the Santiam Canyon fires. There were the fires, the Marshall fire that burned in Colorado, Louisville and Searsville, burned like 1,200 homes in an afternoon. And my friend who works at CU Boulder was at Costco, and like he couldn't even get home. His house burned down from Costco. It was that fast. And those fires are something there's something we used to experience in America in the 19th century, right? In cities, right? The Great Chicago Fire. There was a very big fire in Baltimore. There's a big fire in Boston that burned down thousands of wood structures, right, in an afternoon. And we need to get ahead of that problem if we want to have insurance in California and make sure that it can't happen. And part of the solution to that is like what we would do in the water district, right? Like we might, like the Marin Wildfire Protection Authority, Mark Brown, and is doing a great job trying to build shaded fuel breaks all around the Ross Valley right now. And, sometimes people get upset because Mark's team might show up with a chainsaw and cut down some trees to reduce the number of trees, like to basically create more space between trees. He might do things like limb all the trees up and it looks different. That's one sort of protection. It has proven very effective in certain contexts. Like there was a fire called the Caldor Fire that burned sort of across the Sierra Crest along Highway 50 a couple of years ago. And it was burning at very high intensity over Echo Summit and then burned straight down toward Myers and Christmas Valley, which are the little communities at the base of the hill on 50, if you ever go to South Lake Tahoe. And the flame links were like 20 feet until it hit the edge of the community where a bunch of fuel reduction work had been done for about 10 years. Flame links dropped to 3 feet. The fire departments could stay safely and put out spot fires in the community, and they didn't lose any houses. That's really good community preparation. Part of it is what you do on the edge, but part of it also, and this is something we don't do very well in Marin County. I'm just going to say that out loud. If I don't know if there's anyone from the fire department here or online, but we need to do a lot more. I'll just say that in terms of preparing people's backyards. And the key issue there, also something that is very unpopular, is the 5 feet right around houses, right? So there's a wonderful picture of, if you look for like the Miracle House of Lahaina, you can see a single structure that survived in a neighborhood where every other house burned down. It didn't burn down because it had lava rock in a 5-foot section around kind of a perimeter of lava rock. The owners put it there because they had a termite issue. And apparently termites don't cross lava rock. Like, who knew? But they don't. But the lava rock basically removed any fuel that could burn next to the house and then ignite the house. A big problem in my neighborhood is attached wood fences, right? So wood fences, think about if you ever go look sometime at a movie of what paradise looked like, and you'll see embers flying across the pavement. Like you'll see, if you see a picture of the road, everybody trying to get out, look at the ground and you'll see hundreds of pieces of flame moving along. When those things hit a wood fence, they stop and then they ignite the fence. And then the fence is like a wick burning into the house and it ignites the house and the house burns down. So we have our neighborhood is full of those because the deer come along, and if you don't have a fence, the deer are going to eat your yard, right? And people don't want a ton of deer in their yard eating all their beautiful plants. So there are solutions, right? You get a metal fence that's attached for the 5 feet next to your house. Doesn't look quite as good as the wood fence. The border, we have this conflict in my own family. I would love to have 0 to 5 feet, nothing combustible, because I have sat with people from Santa Rosa and from Paradise and from Redding that are traumatized. One of my closest friends, his kids smell smoke and they totally freak out because they have PTSD from the Tubbs fire. And I don't want my kids to have that kind of PTSD. So implementing those kinds of safety, basic public safety kind of regimens around structures is so important. And it's not a step that we've been able to take in California. We need to help people who can't afford it, but we can do better. And it's really remarkable to see the loss experience data. There's a bunch of people, ourselves included, that are looking into like, can we really identify and value at the state level, where we're looking at all of the losses from wildfire, like what the value of particular structural features are. There's people that the insurance industry sponsors that they have this wind tunnel in North Carolina and they build houses inside it and then burn them down on purpose. I think it's actually a more complicated problem than that, because it matters, like the arrangement of houses matters. That's a thing also where code really matters. In my neighborhood, the code is 8 feet lateral setbacks. So my house ends, and then there's 8 feet to the property line, and then there's another 8 feet, and the next house starts. If that next house, which I would charitably refer to as a Roman candle, were to ignite in a wildfire, I mean, no, I mean, like, the wood
Yeah.
pile is next to the garage under the vent
Oh.
for the garage. So like the garage is going to ignite, the wood pile will ignite, the embers will go in the vent and burn the house down. 8 feet plus 8 feet is 16 feet. That house will generate enough heat, enough radiant heat to ignite my house, unless I build like a concrete wall, right? Which probably I'm not going to do because, again, marital peace. So we need to be thinking about all of these things as we move into an era where climate change, you know, if we stop to go hark back, if we were to reduce emissions to 0 today, the warming that we're going to see to 2050 is going to happen anyway. Emissions reductions now really pay off for my kids' kids. And we need to stay focused on that because I want my grandchildren to have a nice place to live. I want them to enjoy giant sequoias and redwood forests and not have it all be like a burnt shrubland, like the Sierra shrubbery or something, you know, the Sierra like chaparral for landscape. But we also need to think about like what we can do to sort of stabilize communities now, especially, and this is especially true for Marin, like older places. Newer communities are built to codes now that are much more resilient to wildfire through long and hard experience. It's the older places. It's the places like Tam Valley where I live, where the streets are a lane and a half, you know, and it's basically like old ranch land that was subdivided in the 1950s, and all the houses were built and they weren't built to modern code. So they don't actually meet what's called the wildland urban interface code mostly. And we need to figure out ways to help people in those communities. And, you know, Marin, a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people have the money to do the things they need to do around their houses. You go to the Sierra Nevada, it's a totally different story. And we need to find ways to help low-income communities, both in places like Marin, and there are low-income people. Like one of my neighbors is a vet who is on disability. He came home from Vietnam and bought his house in Tam Valley for like $15,000. And he has no cash to like do lots of work and remove a bunch of really expensive trees. It would probably cost him like $50,000 to do the tree work he needs to do. He's not that. So how do we help him so that he doesn't burn our community down or his yard, right? Anyway, these are
Yeah.
questions.
Michael, we had in September, we had an insurance program.
Oh, okay.
And we heard from a couple of speakers about you know, where the insurance market is now in California, and about the need to really, that risk reduction was really important in order to for the insurance market to become more healthy in California, I
Yeah.
would think. And so we heard about some things that we'd have to improve things on a community scale,
Yeah.
as opposed to an individual home scale.
Yes.
So I heard what you just were saying about having to find funds to help people. That seems like a state effort more than a community effort. But are there things that that our local communities could do to sort of improve fire safety as a community?
Yeah. So one thing is that the things we are already doing in Marin are important, right? The MWPA that we all voted for, many of us voted for, to fund actual risk reduction activities in Marin. That's extremely unusual. The only other place that's really doing that in California at the scale of a county is Placer County. And they enacted a parcel tax to try to do similar things in and around Truckee. But it's extremely unusual. And, you know, Truckee is not totally different than Marin. Like there's a lot of vacation homes there. It's easier to pass that I think it applies differently depending on if you're a full-time resident or a vacation home. But I think we need to do more of that at the local level, because the reality is it's the local level that's going to suffer, right? Like if we don't do this, we will not be insurable. Or the insurance costs that we have to bear in order to have homeowners coverage that will allow us to have mortgages, right? And remember, you need to have insurance to have a mortgage, are going to be so high as to even to change the economics of housing in a bad way, and it's not like the economics of housing are in a good way in California, right? Like it's we're not in an acceptable situation right now. So we don't need more. We don't need to pile on there. And risk mitigation is, if it's done thoughtfully, doesn't also have to happen everywhere. And this is an important thing. There are pathways with which from which fire is likely to enter a community and then set off this kind of conflagration effect. There's a lot of interesting work happening now to look at how we can disrupt those fire pathways. So you might not have to harden all the houses in a community. You might have to harden them 10 deep at the mouth of a canyon, right? Where the fire is likely to come down the hill on a bad fall afternoon, and then it has to hit a wall of houses that will not burn. And you could disrupt, it's that wildfire to urban fire transition. If we can break that, right, then we can avoid a lot of the losses that are leading to, I think, accurate perceptions of increased risk of loss from the insurance industry, which then leads to pricing issues and availability issues.
You mentioned Truckee, and I know a little bit about it just because my daughter lives there, and they mandated for 10 feet in from every street in the main part of Truckee, all trees smaller than about 1 foot in diameter breast height had to come out. So everybody's front yard for the 10 feet in, all of the ornamentals went. That sort of mandate seems like it would be a challenge here in Marin.
Well, this is the thing about doing, my analogy for this, I always imagine like a 25-year-old firefighter who is doing his defensible space inspections, and he rolls up to like a really nice house in Ross. And the Ross Valley has about, I think it's got 3 times the fuel load that it had 50 years ago. So like tons of fuel per acre is like 3x what it was 50 years ago. And this firefighter knocks on the door, and let's imagine that, in the old days, Jennifer Siebel Newsom opens the door, and he's like, "Hey, first partner, I gotta have you remove 2 out of every 3 trees in your backyard in order to have a level of fuel loading, or at least adjacent to your house. That nice Japanese maple that you love, that you've helped to grow and nourish, but now it's like overlapping your house, and it's got to come out." And those are really hard conversations. They're not conversations that firefighters like to have, frankly. Like, they are not, firefighters like to help people, to save people. That's their ethos. They're like, they're like people who are willing to risk their lives for their community. And to show up and like then get, and that's like the Ross version. You go to Butte County and you're liable to get run off of someone's lands at the end of a gun, right? Like, let's be clear, like the CAL FIRE people that have to deal with this are in a different world in rural California, or they might get shot because they're on somebody's like pot farm, right? I mean, it's like seriously, this is not a joke. And so it's a really hard conversation, but I think if we don't have it, we're not going to have insurance. I mean, we really aren't. Our insurance situation is falling apart, or we're going to have insurance where ultimately the bearer of risk is the state budget. And we do not want that either, right? Like the total cost of the 17 and 18 fires was something, well, we don't even know. I was just talking to one of the mass tort lawyers because they're concerned. PG&E stock is finally worth enough to pay what they thought they would get, but they priced the losses, the uninsured losses, at about 13 billion. And actually it's more like 19 billion from the Tubbs and Camp Fire. And so there's a $5-6 billion gap. Like, imagine if the total losses in those fires that were, something like $30 billion. That's the size of the current budget deficit in California that's leading to like all these cuts. I saw the memo for CAL FIRE. They aren't allowed to like buy office supplies right now because they have to try to limit their expenditures as much as they can. And that, we can't afford to take that risk. We need to have a private insurance market where we can transfer risk outside of California, or we put a lot of our economic well-being at risk, and good luck building the housing we need so that my kids can afford to live in Marin when they graduate from college, like, or even Northern California. Forget about Marin. Maybe they could live in Sonoma or something.
So on the budget question,
Yes.
so the governor has announced what? I draw down, it's not, I don't know how many billion, but.
Yeah. I think it's about a $6 billion
$6
cut
billion
in
cut
climate
the-
programs.
In his, in the availability of funds in his budget.
Mhm.
So how is this gonna, I mean, do you have any, have you done any work looking at what this might mean to these programs that we're looking at?
Sure. So the question was, what about the budget deficit this year? The climate programs in the budget deficit took call it a 10% hit, maybe a 15% hit, going from I believe about 54 billion to about 48 billion.
Yeah.
And the other thing to note about it is that's kind of an overestimate of the 48, because a lot of the spending has been deferred out to like distant years, right? So like a 2-year expenditure has turned into a 10-year expenditure. And you can say, oh, well, the climate budget is the same, that expenditure is the same, but it's not the same. Like, let's be real, right? In 10 years, Newsom is long gone. He's doing whatever he's doing then. There's a new governor. He may have different priorities. So spending this year is really the only thing that the current governor and the current legislature have control over now. And that cut is larger than that. I guess, is it going to impact things? Yes, it is, right? It's going to make it harder to achieve our climate goals. I am particularly concerned on the wildfire front about seeing a lot of the mitigation dollars, what the firefighters call left of bang, right? The things that try to reduce risk and consequence from wildfire, that's going to see a big cut. And we face budget constraints. Like we're all grownups here. Like we probably, I don't know about all of you, but like I certainly face a budget constraint in my life about like what we do as a family and the kind of house we live in. And that's true at the state level as well. I think it will slow things down. The good news though, is that California and other jurisdictions have made investments that create a general economic a wind that's blowing us toward lower carbon solutions, right? Auto manufacturers are laying off their internal combustion engine design teams. California deserves some of the credit for that. Not all of it, but a good share, a measurable share. The power sector now, nobody builds coal-fired power plants anymore. They would get fired by their board if they proposed that idea. Everyone is building a mix of a heavy dose of solar, a heavy dose of batteries, and some natural gas. And that also California deserves credit for. There is a rooftop solar business that is national. Now, Sunrun's stock isn't worth what it used to be because it was very dependent on the California market. But rooftop solar as an idea and a technology and a business is not going away. And, there are these sort of positive economic forces that I think push in the right direction. The question is, how can we take the money we have and spend it as effectively as possible? And, we do that pretty well in California, but we could do better too.
I have a question about, in Marin County, the funding that we passed, I think it was, I might have the name of it wrong, but I think it was Measure A that, put the money toward, more fuel mitigation, and
Yeah.
I've noticed a big difference since that's been in place of the fuels, management that's happening in the neighborhoods, and
Mhm.
it's even like, I noticed like I live in South Novato and Ignacio, and they even like came onto some of the private property, extended paths.
Yeah.
And did, like some clearance there. I think that's really significant, and I think it's gonna be important to keep that going. And I think it's gonna come back on for renewal at some point soon, and I think it's gonna be really important to do that.
I totally agree. Sure, sorry. The question or the kind of comment was just noticing differences in the landscape in our communities, particularly up in Novato, in terms of the fuels management and fuels reduction that's happening because the Measure A passed and there's now a Marin Wildfire Protection Agency. Measure C? Okay, sorry. And yes, I think it is noticeable. There is enough time now that a big barrier to doing some of those projects is CEQA. And the MWPA, did good CEQA process. And so they are getting through that process now and being able to do larger things. For a few years, they were doing the easy stuff. It didn't require CEQA, more defensible space inspections, things like that, and sort of small projects. And now they are getting to the point where they can do larger projects, landscape scale projects, as people call them in the business. And I guess what I would say is we need to think about the Tubbs fire as the type fire to worry about in our area. The Tubbs fire started at the Mayacamas Mountains, and then it burned out of them into, suburban Santa Rosa and burned down a neighborhood that didn't look anything like the Wooey, right? It was like a neighborhood in the flats in San Rafael or in Mill Valley where I live. And what we need to be thinking about, and there are communities that are more impacted by wildfire that are really trying to do this in far Northern California, is like, how do we create safety? How do we reduce fire intensity in a band around our communities enough in an ecologically sensitive manner, in a way that is going to restore natural ecological process? Because fire is natural, right? And the idea that we're going to get rid of fire is crazy talk. What we can do is choose how and when fire occurs. And we need to do that. That takes also political will. It is smoky when there is a prescribed fire. You talk to any firefighter who does prescribe fire in their off season, and they'll tell you all about the neighbor complaints. They'll tell you all about the challenge of putting fire on the ground, of even changing the look of a community using fuel breaks. And so I guess what I would say is, if we want to have our communities, we want to avoid having, the Tubbs fire reburned a fire footprint that had burned in 1963. In the 63 fire, it took 3 days. The Tubbs fire, before the fire departments, the mutual aid even got there, it was over, right? And the neighborhoods were gone. And we can prevent that. But we have to be willing to do things that do change the look of our neighborhoods, but recognize that the neighborhood look that we have is an artifact of of inaction, of a failure to steward land. And, we work in our team really closely with Native Americans are some of the few tribes that were not fully kicked off their land. And they have deep traditions of burning the landscape. The Miwoks in Northern California did exactly the same thing. And you can see it in the old trees. When you core a redwood that's 1,000 years old, what you'll see is burn scars every few years, every less than 10 years, every 3 to 5 years, up until about 1850. And then settlers, us, showed up and said, oh, there's gold rocks in those creeks. Get out of here. And then the lumber companies showed up and said, hey, Mill Valley, great place to cut down trees and build ships and build houses and supply fuel to San Francisco. And we stopped the stewardship of the land that had occurred for thousands of years. And a lot of our ecosystems are out of whack because of that. They're more drought sensitive. They're more beetle bark sensitive. You see standing dead timber in the Sierra. This is why, right? That we simply do not create, the timber is responding to a changing climate, but it is vulnerable to that changing climate because of the absence of fire. And so we need to do more there, but it's kind of I think of it as like a layered defense. Like, we need to do more in the water district and on the parkland. We need to do more at the edge of communities, like you're noticing in Novato. And we also need to do more, especially around structures.
The other thing that we had in the county at one point, I'm not sure where it stands now,
Okay.
is that there was funding available if the fire department they go in and assess the area and look for especially hazardous places.
Yeah.
And if there was money available to help do certain properties, if it was in an area that a fire department deemed that it needed to be done. And there's a lot of seniors, for example, that live in Marin County and might have, like limited income.
Fixed
at this
income,
point,
yeah.
and that money was available to them that they could apply for it. And I think something like that would be a really great thing to.
I agree.
So.
I agree. I think we need to do more for fixed income residents to help them prepare their homes. I totally agree, especially if they're in very high risk areas and if they're in those fire pathways where their failure to, it's like vaccination, not to raise a controversial topic, but, you know, communities will survive attack by high intensity fire if there are enough homes that have been prepared that they essentially have herd immunity. And we need to create herd immunity in our communities. And that's an individual responsibility, but it's also a collective action problem, right? If we need to find sources of support for the people that don't have means to create that herd immunity. And we're doing that. We're making progress in Marin. I see the differences too in Southern Marin where I live. I'm heartened by them. I also worry that they're not happening fast enough because we're on a treadmill that's speeding up because of climate change.
Michael, we have Mark Brown, who's the
Oh.
head of the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, and who is listening.
Hey, Mark.
And I just
How you doing,
want
Michael?
to
I'm
give
good.
you, Mark, an opportunity to comment if you want.
Oh, I do. First of all, I would never miss hearing Michael talk about everything he's talking about. And I completely agree with every single thing that you said, including that we have not penetrated our residents far enough into helping them understand what they need to do on their properties. I completely agree with you on that. We're fortunate, we're the only county that has the ability to fund our defensible space evaluations. We put $4 million a year towards our defensible space evaluations. We're averaging 30,000 evaluations a year, and we still aren't getting the penetration we need to do. And we're continuing to refine that. Just a quick touch on, we do have a resident grant program that's connected with our evaluation program, and really focusing towards those who are property rich, money poor, so that we can do that. I'm going to mention a little bit that what we're doing in the world of modeling, and then I'm going to ask you a question based on the insurance, combining modeling and insurance. So everything that you're talking about, we're engaging upon. We have our defensible space evaluations. So we're looking at home hardening. We're looking at the fire smart landscaping or lack thereof. And we're modeling that and able to create a risk rating for that property. Then we're combining that modeling with our shaded fuel breaks that we're constructing. So now we're able to model the reduction of risk that we've created through our shaded fuel breaks. Mm-hmm. We're also doing pathways. I think you know that we're also on the front of looking at fire pathways and strategically placed local area treatments so that we can interrupt that pathway. So we're doing all this modeling, but there's a lot of people that are really afraid of catastrophic risk modeling, especially in relation to insurance. And people are afraid that catastrophic risk modeling will drive up insurance rates because many other states that have used catastrophic risk modeling have shown an increase in their insurance rates, not for wildfire, but for other disasters. Mm-hmm. California doesn't allow that for the setting of rates, but we know that the insurance companies are using that to help determine who they insure. Yeah. So I'm of the opinion, I want to get your opinion on this, that cat risk modeling can be our friend if we have enough communities that have and our residents have the wherewithal to vote in something like Measure C and MWPA. If we can get far more communities working at that community level, I think cat risk modeling could be our friend because we can show the insurance industry that we are doing something to decrease the risk and decrease their annual average losses. So just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
So in general, so let me back up and say cat risk modeling is going to happen whether we like it or not. And the reality is that insurers buy their own insurance. It's called reinsurance. And the reinsurers are not regulated by anybody. As far as I can tell, there are people that like park their money in the Caymans and they go to Bermuda once a year to sell what's called capacity to the regular old insurers. And they use cat models. They always have. That's like the foundation of that industry. And our insurers like State Farm or CSAA or whoever are dependent on reinsurers for their business model. So whether we like it or not, and increasingly, I think the reinsurers are the ones that are telling the insurers where they can write and where they can't write. Like they're driving this underwriting decision-making that is driving a lack of availability of regular, called admitted lines coverage, the bread and butter, the normal kind of insurance policy we would like to have. So I don't think we can avoid it. I think it's just here. And in general, I don't think we should be afraid of good science also. Like good science is going to protect us. It may also say that the insurance costs that we used to have are now too low, right? And I think that's another reality that California needs to become a little bit comfortable with. Like, do you think, if you ask a normal person in California, do you think wildfire risk is higher today than you did prior to fall of 2017? I don't think there's a single person that would say, oh, no, it's just the same. Because like, look around. And if the risk is higher, then the insurance should cost more. I agree with you that I think there are really important steps that we can take to reduce risk and that you are taking, the MWPA. And we need to figure out ways to put those into models so they can be valued. And that is starting to happen. You know, the work, there are a few companies that are starting to do this commercially. There's some kind of trial experiments that have been taken as well by a few groups that advise the insurance industry, like Milliman in particular. And in the next, but the reality is like wildfire catastrophe models were kind of not really well developed before about 5 years ago. And then the Tubbs fire happened and it was like a wake-up call, like, oh, it's actually really valuable to have better information about these risks. Because before, you know, you lose a couple hundred houses every once in a while, every 5-10 years, no big deal. But if you're losing 5,000 a year, all of a sudden it's a very big deal. And so there's been a lot of investment, and we're starting to see that investment reach the point where we can actually evaluate the benefits of the work that you do quantitatively in a risk model. And I think in the long run, you know, that's already starting to have effects. Like there's a company called Zesty that advises on underwriting issues in California. And you know, they advise at the structure level about whether an insurer can write a policy for a house. And as those models get more developed and they become more mature and they're tested by experience, which is ultimately the best test of a model, right? Like don't believe the prediction until you see how it does. Then that's going to become more accepted. But I just think like the idea, like in Oregon, people flipped out when the Oregon State Fire Marshal produced risk maps. And they said, oh, that's going to lead to increased insurance prices. But the thing is, the insurers already have way better models than the state of Oregon. The insurers in California have much more sophisticated models than CAL FIRE when it comes to these issues, because they have money on the line, right? They are risking billions of dollars every year. And so of course they're going to invest in understanding their risk better. And they're not stuck with like state contracting, which, you know, is another thing. And so they can buy the best that's available and switch users if they need to, switch suppliers if they need to get the best model and the best estimate of their risk. We need to regulate the insurance industry, right? Like it is effectively like a cartel where there's a few companies that basically write like 85% of the coverage in California. There needs to be good regulation and oversight, but it shouldn't be oversight that says you can't consider climate change. It shouldn't be oversight that says you can't use the best tools to value risk, because what we want our insurers to value the risk and also value the things that we do as communities to create safer, more resilient landscapes, like what you've been doing in Marin for the last few years. And so that's not going to happen if we don't allow modeling tools to be used. There are like important, I think, public transparency concerns that have to get worked through around some of these models, but I also think we're getting there. And the quality of public modeling also has improved dramatically through investments that the state and CAL FIRE have made over the last few years in sort of public modeling consortiums. So I it's a long answer, but I think we're already there. Like whether we like it or not, models are a part of the equation. They are affecting underwriting and they are affecting pricing. And it may be indirect in the sense that, State Farm can't use a model to set its price in California, but its reinsurers sure can. And if it can't buy reinsurance because it insures too many risky properties, then its capital requirements go up and that raises prices for people. So
Yeah.
there's like no way out of this, I guess. And
Yeah,
I think we can embrace it.
And the transparency piece is huge. And so if we, as government entities that strive to be transparent, if we become involved with the modeling, then we can make sure that modeling's involved or transparent. And I saw Ray Moritz, and I know Ray from a long time ago, make a comment that we don't have models about home-to-home spread. We actually now do very recently, and you probably have met Hussam Mahmood from University of Colorado, who's created a public model that has actually very accurate home-to-home spread. And his accuracy has been somewhere between 60 and 80% in retrospective looks at fires that have burned through homes. And so that's amazing accuracy, and coming from University of Colorado, a public entity that helps with the transparency piece. And so we're actually partnering with him as well with our modeling so that we can help convince the insurance industry that we're a good investment.
Stick around. Yeah, I'm getting the signal, Mark, that we have to draw this to a close because we're over time. But I'm so grateful. I'm honestly relieved that I didn't say anything that you disagreed with. Because you know it way better than I do. So it's great to see you.
Okay. So there are some unanswered questions in chat, and I'll at least send them to you, Michael, so you can at least see
Yes.
what they are. So we were indeed lucky to have Michael Wara as our speaker, and these are just two of a couple of dozen topics that Michael could talk on. So we hope to have you back in the future.
That'd be fun.
Good.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks to everyone in person and on Zoom for coming. And want to tell folks that next up is for the next Climate Action Working Group meeting on February 21st. It's 10 to noon, regular time. It'll be on building electrification. And we'll have a great speaker on the Marin Countywide Building Electrification Plan. We're also going to have someone from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District to talk about the rules that effectively ban sale of gas furnaces and water heaters starting in 2027 to 29. So it'll be a good program, and I hope to see people there. But I want to thank you again for being such a fine speaker and for speaking to us here.
Thanks for having me.
No